My son looked me dead in the eyes and said, "The kindest thing you could do for us right now is disappear before our guests arrive. You embarrass us just by standing there." He said it quietly, like he was commenting on the weather, while straightening his tie in the mirror I had paid for, in the restaurant I had funded, wearing the confidence that my $300,000 had bought him. What he didn't know was that I had made a phone call 40 minutes earlier. One call, and that call was already unraveling everything he thought he owned. Subscribe and leave a comment telling me what state you're watching from, because what I discovered about my son in the days that followed will shock you no matter where in America you're sitting right now. My son's words hit me the way cold water hits you in the dark. I was standing near the host station of Garland and Cross, the restaurant he and my daughter-in-law had been building for 2 years, the restaurant whose walls I had helped paint, whose kitchen equipment I had researched for months, whose liquor license fees I had quietly covered when they came up short. It was the night of the grand opening. 80 guests were arriving in 3 hours. Reservation cards had been sent. A local food blogger had confirmed attendance. The Savannah Morning News had promised a feature, and my son was asking me to leave. I had driven 4 hours from Charleston that morning. I had pressed my best blazer. I had brought a card with a handwritten note inside, congratulating them on everything they had built. I had not yet told them the note also contained a check for $5,000 as an opening night gift, because that was the kind of father I had always been. Generous. Quiet about it. Foolishly quiet about it. "You're not our demographic," my daughter-in-law said from across the bar, not even turning around from where she was arranging champagne flutes. She had a way of delivering cruelty with her back turned, like the conversation wasn't worth her full attention. "The whole concept here is young professionals, sophisticated crowd. You walking around in that blazer asking people where they're from is going to undermine the atmosphere we've built." My blazer. She was criticizing my blazer in a building my retirement savings had made possible. My son finally turned from the mirror. "Look, Dad, we appreciate everything. We really do. But tonight has to be perfect. And honestly, your energy is going to make us anxious. You understand, right? Just go back to the hotel, watch some TV, get a good dinner somewhere. We'll call you tomorrow when things settle down." My energy. After 2 years of writing checks and never asking for credit. After letting them put only their names on the menus and the signage and the Instagram account. After listening to my daughter-in-law talk about their vision and their concept and their brand without once saying the words, "your father," in any sentence that involved gratitude. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. My voice was steadier than I expected. My son shrugged the way I had watched him shrug since he was 15 years old. That particular shrug that meant he had already moved past the inconvenience of caring. "There's a Marriott 2 miles from here. Perfectly nice. We booked you a room." They had already booked me a room. They had planned this before I arrived. I looked around the restaurant. Dark wood tables I had sourced from a reclaimed lumber place in Bluffton. The bar stools I had helped carry in from a rental truck at 7 in the morning 6 months ago. The framed vintage Savannah prints on the wall, 3 of which I had found at an estate sale and shipped to them as a surprise. My fingerprints were on every surface of this room, and I was being asked to disappear before the guests arrived so I wouldn't ruin the atmosphere. "You're right," I said. "I should go." My son looked relieved in that fast, unguarded way that tells you the relief was already waiting just beneath the surface. He clapped me once on the shoulder, the kind of clap that says goodbye, more than it says anything warm. "We'll get brunch tomorrow," he said. "Just the 3 of us." I nodded. I picked up my jacket from the coat hook near the entrance, the coat hook I had installed myself on a Saturday in February when my son's hands were too busy with the wine menu to hold a drill. I walked to my car, but I did not drive to the Marriott. I drove to the parking garage 2 blocks away, turned off the engine, and called Raymond Ochoa. Raymond had been my attorney for 19 years. He had handled my divorce, my property transfers after my wife passed, the sale of my house in Mount Pleasant, and every major financial decision I had made since I was 48 years old. I called his cell because it was a Thursday evening, and I knew he would answer because Raymond always answered. "Victor," he said. "What's wrong?" It wasn't a question. He knew my voice. I told him everything. The dismissal tonight, the booked hotel room, the 2 years of contributions. I told him about the initial $150,000 I had wired when they found the space on Drayton Street and needed to move fast or lose it. I told him about the $40,000 in equipment costs when the commercial kitchen came in over budget. I told him about the smaller amounts that had accumulated like water damage, quietly and constantly, until the total somewhere. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Victor, do you remember the conversation we had in March of last year? When you called me worried about how the ownership structure was set up?" I remembered being worried. I remembered Raymond being more worried than I was and insisting on something. I had been so focused on keeping peace with my son, on not being the difficult father who made everything about money, that I had let Raymond handle the details while I nodded and signed where he pointed. "Raymond," I said, "please tell me you did something." "I did something," he said. "When you expressed concern about the informal nature of the arrangement, I insisted on filing a formal investment agreement. You provided capital, not a gift. The documents reflect a 28% equity stake in Garland & Cross LLC, with your name listed as a co-investor on the operating agreement. Your son signed those documents. Your daughter-in-law initialed every page." I stared through the windshield at the parking garage wall. "Are you certain?" "Certain. The business is worth something now. A restaurant in that location with that build-out, before it even opens, a conservative valuation puts it at $750,000. 28% of that is approximately $210,000, more than you put in." Through the parking garage, I could see the edge of Drayton Street. In 3 hours, 80 people were going to walk into a restaurant that I partially owned and celebrate my son's success while I watched television at a Marriott 2 miles away. "Raymond," I said slowly, "what are my options?" He was quiet in the careful way that meant he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "As a minority equity partner, you have rights. You can request a formal buyout at fair market value. You can request an audit of how capital contributions were deployed. You can petition for a forced dissolution if the other partners refuse to engage. And given the size of your investment and the documented history, you have standing to do all of it." I watched a couple walk past the garage entrance dressed for a nice dinner, laughing at something on their phone. "What would happen to tonight's opening if I filed a notice of dispute with the operating agreement?" Raymond paused. "It wouldn't stop the opening, but it would create a legal cloud over the business that would complicate any future financing, any sale, any outside investment. Any serious party doing due diligence would find it immediately. And your son would be notified by end of business tomorrow." Tomorrow. While they were still celebrating. "Raymond," I said, "prepare a formal notice of my equity rights and a request for an accounting of all capital deployed. I want it ready to send first thing in the morning." "Victor, are you sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything since I sold my house in Mount Pleasant." After I hung up, I sat in the parking garage for a few minutes. I thought about my wife, Lorraine. We had been married for 31 years before her heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in April, 7 years ago. She had adored our son the way only mothers can adore a difficult child, completely and without conditions. But she had also been the one who would look at me across the dinner table and raise one eyebrow in that particular way that meant she saw exactly what I was choosing not to see. She would not have let this go on for 2 years. I drove to the Marriott, not because they had sent me there, but because it was convenient and I needed sleep. I ordered dinner from room service, poured myself a glass of the bourbon I keep in my travel bag for emergencies, and sat in the chair by the window watching the city lights. I was asleep by 10. My phone started ringing at 11:43. "Dad." My son's voice was completely different from the one that had asked me to leave 5 hours ago. That voice had been smooth and dismissive. This voice was cracked at the edges. "What did you do? What did you do to us?" I set down my phone, turned on the lamp, and took a slow breath. "What do you mean?" "Raymond Ochoa called me tonight. At 11 o'clock at night he called to inform me that you are claiming an equity stake in our restaurant." "Our restaurant, Dad. The one we built." I let the silence sit for a moment. "The one we built with $223,000 of my retirement savings," I said. "Yes, that restaurant. You said that money was a gift. You never once said it was an investment." "I said it was support. Raymond made it an investment agreement because that is what a responsible attorney does when his client transfers that amount of money to a family member without a formal structure. You signed the documents, son. You initialed every page. I was emotional when I signed those. We were in escrow. Everything was moving fast. You handed me a stack of papers and said, 'Sign here.' I trusted you, and I trusted you," I said quietly. to treat me like a partner instead of an inconvenience. Tonight you booked me a hotel room so I wouldn't embarrass you at the opening of a business I funded. The silence on his end was a different kind of silence now. My daughter-in-law's voice came on in the background, sharp and insistent. Tell him he has no claim. Tell him we'll fight it. My son came back on. Vivienne says the agreement won't hold up. She's already texting her cousin who does business law. Tell her cousin to look up the operating agreement on file with the Georgia Secretary of State's office, I said pleasantly. Raymond was thorough. Have a good night. I hung up. I slept well, genuinely well, for the first time in months. The next morning I was having coffee in the hotel lobby when my daughter-in-law appeared. She must have driven directly from the restaurant because she was still wearing the same silk blouse from the opening, and her mascara had traveled south in the way that suggested the night had not ended well. She crossed the lobby with the energy of someone who had been rehearsing a speech in the car. You have some nerve, she said, sitting down across from me without being invited. We worked for 2 years on that restaurant, blood and sweat and 18-hour days. You wrote some checks, and now you think you own us? I poured a second cup of coffee from the carafe on the table. I own 28% of the business, I said. That is what the documents say. Those documents were signed under duress. We were in escrow. We didn't understand what we were agreeing to. You are both college-educated adults who had 2 days to review those documents before signing. Raymond sent them in advance. She leaned forward. What is it you actually want, Victor? You want credit? Fine. We'll put your name on the website. We'll mention you in interviews. Is that what this is about? Your ego? My ego. I had been sleeping in a guest room that wasn't called a guest room simply because they didn't have a better word for where the man who paid for the house was supposed to stay. I had shown up last night with a card and a check, and they had handed me a hotel reservation. What I want, I said, is to be treated like a human being. What I want is for my son to look at me and understand that the money I gave him represented 15 years of careful saving after his mother died, and I sold the home we had shared for 3 decades. What I want is to not be asked to disappear from a room I helped build because my blazer doesn't match the demographic. She started to speak. I kept going. But since that appears to be more than either of you is willing to offer, I'll settle for a fair accounting of my investment and a buyout at current valuation. Raymond will send the formal request today. She stood up. This is war, she said. I hope you know that. Family doesn't declare war, I said. Family doesn't book hotel rooms for the fathers who funded their dreams. So I suppose we've established that this was never really family. She left. I finished my coffee. What I did not tell her was that Raymond had called me at 7 that morning with something else entirely. Something that changed the entire shape of what I thought was happening. Victor, Raymond said when I picked up, I've been pulling financials in preparation for the accounting request, and I found something that has nothing to do with the equity dispute. He walked me through it slowly. When the restaurant had applied for a small business development grant from the Georgia Department of Community Affairs 18 months ago, the application had listed me as a co-applicant. My name, my social security number, my credit profile. They had used my information to qualify for the application, which listed me as an investor with a passive role and no ongoing involvement, effectively hiding my active financial contributions to make the arrangement appear more favorable on paper. The grant was for $38,000. It had been awarded and deposited into the Garland and Cross operating account. I never signed any grant application, I told Raymond. No, he said, you didn't, but someone did using your information. And the application contained material misrepresentations about your role that would constitute grant fraud if the state investigates. My son and daughter-in-law had used my identity to apply for a government grant. While taking my money, while accepting my labor, while planning to exclude me from the opening night of the restaurant I had made possible, they had simultaneously filed paperwork with the state of Georgia in my name without my knowledge. Raymond, I said carefully, what are the implications? Grant fraud is a state offense. Depending on how the DA's office looks at it, misrepresentation on a state-funded application can carry significant penalties. Identity fraud for financial gain is its own charge. This is not a civil matter, Victor. This is potentially criminal. I sat in that hotel room for a long time after we hung up. I looked at Lorraine's photograph, I carry a small framed print of her in my travel bag because I am a sentimental man, and I am not ashamed of that. I looked at her face and I thought about the son she had raised, the boy who had her eyes and my stubbornness, and I tried to reconcile that boy with the man who had filed fraudulent state documents in his father's name. I could not reconcile them. I thought about what she would have said. She had a gift for honesty that never felt cruel. She would have said, "You can love someone and still make them face what they've done. Protecting people from consequences isn't love. It's just postponing the damage." I called Raymond back. "File the equity accounting request," I said, "and prepare a report of findings regarding the grant application to submit to the Georgia Secretary of State's Fraud Division." "Victor, are you absolutely sure? Once we submit to the state, it's out of our hands." "I have been sure since 11:43 last night when my son asked me what I did to him rather than what he had done to me." The next 72 hours moved like a storm you can see coming from a long way off but cannot stop. Raymond filed the equity accounting request on Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, my son called 3 times, and I let each call go to voicemail. My daughter-in-law sent a text that read, "We are prepared to discuss a reasonable arrangement. Please call us back." The word reasonable, coming from her, had the particular quality of a door being held open just far enough to suggest there might be a trap on the other side. Raymond filed the report to the Secretary of State's office on Friday evening. He was careful, thorough, and attached every piece of documentation he had, including the grant application, the deposit records, and a timeline of my financial contributions that he had reconstructed from bank records. On Saturday, I drove back to Charleston. I spent the weekend doing the things I had been doing since Lorraine died, and the house got quiet. I walked along the Battery in the mornings. I read. I had dinner with my neighbor Gerald, who is 72 and tells better stories than anyone I've met since Lorraine, and I did not tell him what was happening because I was not ready to say it out loud yet. On Monday morning, investigators from the Georgia Secretary of State's office contacted Garland and Cross, LLC. My son called me that afternoon. He did not sound like the man who had asked me to disappear before the guests arrived. He sounded the way people sound when they realize that the floor they were standing on was not as solid as they had believed. "Dad, please." His voice was stripped of everything performative. Just his voice, the one I recognized from when he was young and genuinely frightened. "Please, I'm asking you as your son. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you knew about the application. Tell them anything. Vivian is talking to a criminal lawyer, and he's saying this is serious." I sat in my reading chair by the window and looked out at the harbor. "I never authorized that application," I said. "That is the truth. We were trying to help ourselves. We didn't think it would matter to you. You used my social security number on a government document without my knowledge. You checked a box confirming my consent that I never gave. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a choice." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you want from us?" "I want what I have always wanted," I said. "I want my son to understand that I am a person, not a resource. I have wanted that for a long time. I stopped believing I could have it about 3 months ago. What I want now is for this process to proceed honestly, and for you both to cooperate fully with investigators rather than making this worse." He hung up without saying anything else. I sat with that silence for a long while. The investigation moved with the particular bureaucratic efficiency of a state agency that takes grant fraud seriously. Within 3 weeks, the findings were referred to the district attorney's office. Both my son and my daughter-in-law retained criminal defense attorneys. The restaurant's operating accounts were temporarily frozen during the review period, which meant the second payroll after the grand opening did not go out on time. The staff noticed. 2 of the 3 servers they had hired gave notice within a week. The food blogger who had attended the opening posted a polite but pointed observation on her website about early operational instability at a promising new spot on Drayton Street. My daughter-in-law's parents drove up from Jacksonville, and there was apparently a long and unpleasant meeting at the restaurant during which a great deal of recrimination happened. I know this because my son's college roommate, a man named Desmond who had always been decent to me at holidays, called to tell me. He was not calling to take sides. He was calling to tell me that my son had broken down during that meeting and admitted that the money problems had been worse than he had let anyone know, and that he had convinced himself I would never find out about the grant application, because I was too trusting to look carefully. Too trusting. I had been called dead weight in different language. Raymond negotiated the equity buyout over the following 6 weeks. The restaurant's formal valuation came in at $720,000, which was close to his initial estimate. 28% of that was $201,600. After Raymond's fees and the time value calculations he insisted on including, I walked away with just over $190,000. More than I had put in. Every single cent. The criminal matter resolved in a way that was quieter than it might have been. My son's attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement. My daughter-in-law, who had been the one to actually complete and submit the application, agreed to plead to a reduced charge, pay restitution of the full $38,000 plus penalties, and complete 200 hours of community service. My son, whose involvement was ruled to be secondary, received deferred adjudication and probation. Neither of them went to prison. I had not asked for prison. I had asked for honesty and consequences. The legal system had provided consequences. Honesty I was still waiting on. The restaurant stayed open. They were able to restructure the operating agreement after the buyout cleared, bring in a small outside investor to replace my stake, and continue operating. The Savannah Morning News feature ran eventually, 2 months late, and did not mention any of what had happened. That is probably for the best. The food is apparently quite good. I've been told this by people who have no reason to soften it. I live differently now. This is the part I want you to understand. I am 67 years old. I retired from 31 years of structural engineering at a firm in Charleston that built things meant to last. I know something about foundations. I know that what fails is almost never the material itself. What fails is the joint between materials. The connection point. The place where one thing meets another and the bond is weaker than either surface made it appear. I had a weak joint with my son for a long time. I told myself it was love holding us together. But it was something closer to hope. And hope is not a structural element. I have a 1-bedroom apartment on Sullivan's Island now, closer to the water than I have lived since I was young. I can hear the Atlantic from my kitchen in the morning when the wind is right and the traffic on the island hasn't started yet. Lorraine's photograph is on the mantelpiece where she belongs, not tucked away in a travel bag. I joined a woodworking class at the recreation center, something I had told myself I would do for 20 years, and never managed to fit into the schedule of a man who was busy making himself useful to people who expected it without saying thank you. I am not very good at it yet. But I am there every Tuesday and Thursday, and the instructor is a woman named Patricia who has no patience for excuses and an excellent sense of humor, and I look forward to those evenings more than I look forward to most things. I have had 2 dinners with a woman named Carol, who lives in Mount Pleasant, and lost her husband 3 years ago to the same quiet kind of cardiac event that took Lorraine. We are not rushing anything. We walk on the beach and talk about books and our children and our lives. And she is honest in the way that people who have been through real grief tend to be honest. Without decoration, without agenda. I am grateful for her company in a way that surprises me some evenings. My son called me 6 weeks after the legal matters closed. It was a Sunday morning. He said, "Dad, I know I have no right to ask you to hear me out." I said, "Go ahead." He talked for a long time. He was not making excuses, or if he was not very good at it, which meant some part of him was trying not to. He said he had spent so many years feeling like a disappointment to me without knowing how to talk about it that he had turned the resentment into distance and the distance into something he couldn't name but was ashamed of now. He said Vivian had made it worse and he had let her because it was easier than addressing it directly. He said he was in therapy now, which I had been suggesting for 15 years. I listened to all of it. I did not tell him it was fine. I did not tell him we were all good now. I told him I heard him, and that I was glad he was getting help, and that I needed more time. He said he understood. We hung up without making any plans. That is the honest shape of where things stand. Not a clean ending, not a door slammed shut, not a door thrown open. Something more like a window cracked just enough to let air in without making any promises about the weather. I want to tell you something that I have been thinking about since the night I sat in that parking garage in Savannah with Raymond Ochoa's voice on the phone explaining to me that I had rights I didn't know I had. For most of my adult life, I believed that loving someone meant absorbing their failures quietly so they never had to face them. I thought that was strength. I thought it was what my father had done for me, and his father before him. And I thought that was the tradition I was honoring when I wrote check after check and asked for nothing in return. But Lorraine knew better. She used to say that you cannot help someone grow by standing between them and the ground. She meant it about children, but she would have meant it about this too. I was not protecting my son when I gave without terms and accepted treatment without response. I was allowing him to believe that love is something you can collect without earning. That is not a gift. That is a damage I inflicted slowly over years, disguised as generosity. I learned that lesson at 67 years old in a hotel room in Savannah with a glass of bourbon and my wife's photograph and a phone call I almost didn't make. Don't wait as long as I did. If this story touched something in you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below and tell me what state you're watching from. And tell me what you would have done in that parking garage. Would you have made the call? I would love to hear from you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. There are more stories coming, and some of them will change the way you think about the people closest to you.